Hey guys, today we're going to talk about Nelson Mandela. He is one of the greatest leaders to ever grace the earth. What? You don't believe me? I have 5 reasons why you're wrong and I'm right. Number 1, his commitment. Now, from the time he was born, Nelson Mandela could understand the status quo in South Africa. Whites on top and blacks on the bottom. So he became passionate in the idea of a multicultural society, not dominated by a single race. So first he became a lawyer, one of few of color in the time in the country, and then joined the African National Congress, ANC, and at this time was a lobbyist group for anti-apartheidism. With his charismatic voice and ability to bring sharp, truthful points to discussions in meetings, he quickly rose to the ranks of the party. With these promotions, blacks in South Africa widely began to know him, and the government as well. With his civil disobedience towards the government, many of his rights were taken away, such as taking a flight, leaving the country, publishing a newspaper, or saying a speech. Eventually, he was arrested for breaking these terms and armed conflict against the government and went to prison. Now, for most people, they would at this time would see Nelson Mandela as another black politician giving his life up for the struggle and be forgotten as well. And this would be the case if Nelson Mandela was a normal person, but Nelson Mandela was not. He was different. Nelson Mandela always stuck to his roots. He always woke up at 3 a.m. and ran through the streets of Johannesburg and always ate healthy for a good healthy body. In prison, Nelson Mandela taught young prisoners of the ideals and teachings of anti-apartheidism. This ensured that the movement would stay within millennials at the time. Number 2, working with South Africa's last state president to bring the downfall of apartheid. Now, even though these two men, F.D. de Klerk and Nelson Mandela, both earned the Nobel Peace Prize for the downfall of apartheid, it wasn't a happy relationship, to say the least. For years, these two had a bitter relationship over the future of South Africa. Now, even though both men wanted greater freedoms for people of color, de Klerk still wanted to hold on to white power in the country. In fact, reports suggest that de Klerk funded third-party groups to inflame tensions called black-on-black violence, which was fought between Nelson Mandela's African National Congress and a Zulu Nationalist Party, the Intaka Freedom Party, in the country to distract from. This is the reason they did this, was to distract from horrible government rule. This tactic was seen in British colonial rule and was called divide and conquer, which shows the scale and severity of de Klerk's actions. However, with all of these problems, eventually an agreement was reached in 1992 between black leaders and the white government to eventually put democratic elections in the country. This happened in 1994. Number 3, putting pressure to end apartheid. Even before the release of Nelson Mandela, there was huge amounts of pressure put on South Africa by the international community to end this segregationist system. However, these sayings and talks were all ignored by the South African government. Maybe a reason was that this movement didn't have a face to it, a poster boy for a movement that would dominate world headlines for years. However, Nelson Mandela, with again his charismatic voice, helped persuade many nations to put economic sanctions on South Africa. Economic sanctions, if you don't know, are how countries get other countries to change their ways by putting heavy economic stress on a country so they can force to do something morally just or unjust. And this is what happened. The value of the South African currency, the rand, fell miserably low. And white South African workers, which is something that F.D. de Klerk and his National Party stood for and defended, also got really tired and really restless. And this is some from the reasons that the South African apartheid system fell apart. Lastly, winning the South African general elections in 1994. Firstly, as mentioned before, getting multicultural elections in the country was a 500-year-old struggle in the country. However, the elections itself was a corruption melting point. I will now be reading an excerpt from Nelson Mandela, Long Road to Freedom by Barry Dingelberg. Voting procedures were at times chaotic and corrupt. People voted more times when they were supposed to, and ballot boxes were sometimes tampered with. However, these irregularities weren't enough to ruin South Africa's first presidential election, and Nelson Mandela and his African National Congress were swept into power in a landslide and therefore creating a new chapter in South Africa's history. However, is Nelson Mandela the greatest leader in the world? Was he the greatest leader in history? Say, compared to someone like Napoleon? Well, let's compare them. Napoleon versus Mandela. I personally would say Mandela. Nelson Mandela was the game changer. For 500 years, blacks in South Africa were oppressed, brutally assimilated by the white people in the country. And until this man changed the country, there was no hope for black South Africans living in poverty, impoverishment, while white people lived in first world status. No, while Napoleon was a brilliant military general, his effects on Europe were very minuscule and not long lasting. Also, Napoleon's movement was not based on freedom. It actually took away rights to women and empowered them less. While Mandela was a leader for all, and that's why Napoleon is not the best leader in the world. And this is why Nelson Mandela is the greatest leader in history and deserves a chapter in our history textbooks here in Canada. In conclusion, Nelson Mandela was one of the greatest leaders in the world, and his influence and ideals on liberty and human rights were immeasurable.